Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Hi, hello, good evening. Can I hear a louder good evening? Come on. Well, the first benchers are always super duper excited, but what about the last bench people? Can I hear a louder good evening? I can see a gentleman saying hi there. Yes, hi, hello, welcome. Once again, a very, very warm welcome to all the ladies and gentlemen present here. And let's have a huge, huge round of applause for ourselves as let's begin this evening, which was brought to you by Transformation Agenda 2020. Let's have a huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Navyata, and I'm going to be your presenter for today. The world is at a point of inflection with respect to the climate crisis. India, given its size and stature in the global economy, has an important role to play in evolving a global consensus to combat climate change. On this platform, Mint and Danfoss bring together a panel of experts in order to review India's climate imperatives. Also, please join the conversation on Twitter by using our hashtag Transformation Agenda and also tag us at Mint Conclaves. To start the proceedings, may I please invite on stage Mr. Anil Padmanabhan, the executive editor from Mint, to deliver the welcome address for all of us. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, as we welcome on stage Mr. Anil Padmanabhan. A very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you. Such an enthusiastic MC, I think we have a great evening ahead when we get into the panel. Thank you, everyone. Welcome today evening to Mint's event. I know it's a working day and all of you have gone that extra mile to be with us. Your gesture is much, much appreciated by all of us. But trust me, your time will be well spent. So, because I have a heads up on this panel, which you don't have as yet. So with that advantage, let me assure you, this is going to be an outstanding evening. Today's is just a brief background. Today is the concluding episode of what was a 4-part series called Transforming Agenda 2020, which Mint put together with Danfoss. And here I really like to, special note of thanks to Danfoss, Ravi is present here, that they backed this project so wholeheartedly. And it's been a long journey and excellent one. I presume it is just the beginning and we look forward to more associations. So previously we covered the subject areas of energy, food and infrastructure. And in exploring this transformative agenda that India can pursue to achieve its desired potential, which all of us believe it already has, it's actually in economic terms is already a middle income economy. So, but how do we make it more equitable? How do we make it more transformative, more participative? That was the idea when we set off with this project. Today we have picked up an extremely vexing agenda item, which is climate change. There was a time when it was primarily a topic of conferences and activists, and actually one of the panelists present here was my first introduction into environment when his activist days when we were young. So it was interesting to meet up with Jagdish Krishnaswamy, who you'll shortly hear from. And people like him are the ones who educated me along the way on the importance of environment. But probably a decade ago, we suddenly realized that it was something that would impact the Aam Aadmi. And that is what all of us have begun to feel, and there are 2 words now, catchphrase worldwide called global warming, but it's far, far more than that. And it's the reason we took up Bangalore as the final venue and the location for climate change, as many of you are residents, long-term residents of the city. So you do feel the effects of climate change in the very basic sense. But it's also a city which is of enormous hope because, trust me, it's the new Adda of India. The intellectual heft that Bangalore city has, I don't think any city has. It's extremely enviable intellectual heft. And I think if a solution has to come and to be implemented, it has to probably come from Bangalore. So exactly why it fits in so well with our own agenda of propagating change. With this in mind, we have an excellent panel of domain experts, and you will hear at length from them. And preceding them will be a keynote address by Rajat Kathuria. so dear friend of Mint, and a person who's been closely associated with this subject of climate change, on which I'm sure he'll dwell on. So ladies and gentlemen, sit back and enjoy the conversation. Without much more ado, turn back to our enthusiastic MC. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for completing the moment for all of us. Moving on now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to invite on stage Dr. Rajat Kathuria, the Director and Chief Executive from Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, to join us on stage to deliver the keynote address for all of us. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, as we welcome on stage Dr. Rajat Kathuria.
Thank you so much for the kind words. And before I start talking on the subject, let me thank profusely Mint and, of course, Anil, an old friend, and Danfoss Ravi for organizing this. I think this is not a moment too soon. In fact, it might be too late to be thinking about climate change. And I think Anil set the agenda really well in the sense that he said that this is a vexing problem. And I really want to start from there, why it is a vexing problem, and why I think, or why we think at ICRIER, this is a vexing problem. Before I get into the agenda, let me say that I don't know how many of you have heard about ICRIER. ICRIER, was founded in 1981, and we've been working on really trade issues, issues relating to the macroeconomy, international finance, and trade. We were recognized as a trade institution. But as you know, globalization has made a fuzziness between what is the international agenda and what is the domestic agenda. And they are, I think, inextricably linked. And therefore, it was a natural progression for ICRIER to move on to look at some vexing issues that are affecting our policy making and policy formulation. And one of them, of course, I'll talk about a few of the other vexing agendas that we have in India today, like jobs and inequality, which as I said, Anil set the tone really well, and I'll dwell a little bit on both of them, but of course the focus is going to be on climate change. And we started work, we pride ourselves as an institution that provides evidence-based inputs to policymakers so that they can take informed decisions, both at the state level as well, of course, at the center. And we pride ourselves of trying to sort of look at emerging issues. So when we started looking at trade in 1981, it wasn't until 1991 that India actually liberalized and integrated with the global economy, but we had been able to create a fair amount of evidence on international trade and what it would mean for India to begin to engage on a global stage in the world economy on international trade. And therefore, there was ready-made input for policymakers, not only us, but there were several other institutions that are working on those, both at the national level as well at the sectoral level. There were sort of numbers, there was data, there was analysis that was available so that they could act on that. And the reason I'm saying this is because climate change, I think, and I may be wrong on this, but I think climate change and a couple of other issues like urbanization did not find mainstream sort of focus on the economic policy making agenda in India until, almost maybe a decade ago or a decade and a half ago. They were, at best, they were peripheral to the agenda because India's agenda really was about how do you create growth and how is that growth going to affect the people, how are you going to create jobs, how are you going to have distributional equity, and how is agriculture, industry, and services, that structural transformation that we talk about so often in India that has gone wrong. That was really the economic agenda at the Planning Commission that was really paramount, that was privileged in some sense over the other agendas like urbanization and climate change. And I think it's important that it's good, in fact, it was imperative that we recognized that the economic agenda could not be looked at in isolation from both the climate change agenda as well as the urbanization agenda. And I'm really happy now there's a fair amount of integration between what we do in the economy as economists, what we do, and what we do as climate change scientists, what we do as urban planners, and how we plan our urbanization. There is a multidisciplinary approach to the problem of economic policy making. And I don't even want to dwell on the problems of economic policy making and how difficult it is for implementation to happen. All of you live in India, all of you live in you know exactly what the problems are of implementation of policy, what the political economy is. Our former governor of the Reserve Bank said once in Davos that when he was asked what are the major problems of the Indian economy, and he said there are 3 problems, and he said implementation, implementation, implementation. Meaning that, policy is there, but it's not implemented well. And the reason sort of this is important to recognize is that the policy package with respect to anything, especially with climate change, has to include a political economy and therefore has to include implementation. You can't leave out a large chunk of the people from the agenda of economic policy and therefore implementation, because then political economy will come in the way of successful implementation of any policies. With that background, we in ICRIER in about 5-6 years ago, we became a part of a consortium which is called the New Climate Economy, and I won't dwell too much on what the New Climate Economy is, but it's a sort of a collaboration of 9 global kind of institutions funded by 9 different countries, and they all came together to try and think about how best it is to build a narrative around climate change that can actually distill down not only at the national level in various countries, but also at the subnational, regional, and of course municipal levels. And that narrative, it was important to change that narrative. And that narrative was that, very simply, that growth and climate are goals that cannot be achieved simultaneously. They are in conflict. And that's what you were starting with. In fact, everybody in India who's worked on climate change first recognizes that that is a deep perception amongst not only policymakers, but a lot of people, that growth cannot be achieved with benign climate impact. So if you're going to address both climate and growth together, there has to be a change in narrative. And that's what we set out to do right about 5 years ago. And you'll see a lot of those papers and documents on the website. I'm just going to take out a few sort of key ideas from there and put them before you, to try, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that there may not be conflict between the two even today, but at a macro level, when you said that growth and climate is like a 2-horse race, then you're actually not including into your economic formulation all the costs that are associated with the impacts of high growth policies. And when you look at air pollution, you look at the health impacts, you look at all the problems that climate change can cause, you would begin to understand that growth can actually happen while you're addressing your climate goals. And that was a narrative. It's a challenge. That narrative still exists, and people say, how can you achieve sustainability if you're going to grow at 8-9%? And I think that narrative needs to be changed in India, not only at the national level. That narrative needs to be changed at the subnational and regional levels as well. And how can you change that narrative? Well, of course, one way is by think tanks, the other is, of course, advocates and activists. But you have to be inclusive in what you do. Your economic modeling has to be inclusive. Remember, very long ago in the 1930s, those of you read or even heard about one of the Nobel laureates in economics by the name of Ronald Coase, who talked about externalities and the theory of social cost. He said a very simple thing, which is that firms, individuals will not recognize or internalize the cost that they impose on society. And you know that in Bangalore. I don't have to tell you that firms that are dumping effluents and sewage into public places and public water bodies are not internalizing the costs of what they are imposing on society. And very simply, there is no incentive for any individual or any firm to begin to account for those externalities that are being imposed on society in general and on people individually in particular. And I think that is a big sort of deficiency when we talk about growth and climate. That was one of the deficiencies that existed. Once you begin to take into account those externalities, you get different results. I'm not saying that you'll get results which give you that growth and climate can go together all the time, but you are beginning to change the narrative when you recognize that growth can actually happen. Your 7.5%, the video mentioned, it can actually begin to happen while you're also beginning to address your climate goals. And it's not difficult in India to be able to actually achieve at least, I don't know the percentage, but 60 and 70% of what we need. And this number is not a deterministic number. I don't want to be dogmatic about it, but a ballpark number, and I'll explain myself, that if you 60 or 70% of what you need to actually do to achieve your climate goals are actually policies that we need to take into account and address for our own sake within the country to address some of the distortions that we've created. But recognizing that we don't sort of disproportionately affect the marginalized. And I will tell you exactly what I mean as I develop this argument. But when I say 60 to 70% or whatever that number is, these are simple policies or simply policies that will begin to address the problems of your fossil fuels, begin to address the subsidies that exist in the system. They will begin to address some of the policies that are associated with production of agriculture, in manufacturing. And of course, on the supply side, you would have a sort of a smooth transition away from fossil fuels into renewables. And we made a lot of commitments in Paris. Our nationally determined contributions in Paris will mean that if we achieve all of those, it will mean that we are well within the limit of what we need to contribute to ensure that the 2 degrees Celsius agenda is met, at least from our perspective. Of course, the rest of the world also needs to do what it needs to do. But framing the problem in the manner that we've always framed it, in the sense that this is not a problem that was created by us. It was not a problem that was created by emerging markets and developing countries, and therefore we shouldn't have to be a part of the solution. This might be a good way of formulating an international negotiation strategy, but I don't think it works very well when you're trying to design a climate agenda and a climate policy for domestic reasons. And why I say that in a minute, later on I will elaborate, that the impacts of climate change are disproportionately felt, not by you and me. They are disproportionately felt by the more vulnerable. And that's, I think, the contestations on that are fairly limited. Just like to give you an example, on the developed world has much more ability to adapt and mitigate, and therefore sort of address the problems of climate change much better at a macro level than emerging markets do, and therefore we ask for technical and financial assistance through the Global Environmental Facility, which may or may not come into the country. But they are much better able to address because they're rich. Similarly, the rich within countries are much better able to address the problems associated with climate change than the poor are able to do. And therefore, for the sake of the vulnerable, for the sake of the poor, we need to begin to address the climate goals now. Because as the video said, we don't even have an idea of where we are headed with this business as usual urbanization and business as usual policies that we have in place. And if we continue down that road, then not only are we not going to achieve at a global level and a national level the 2-degree agenda, but we are also going to make the coastal regions. And I think what is a little not as well understood is that there are hotspots within the country that are going to have even more impacts on living standards if we don't begin to address them now. And I'll say a little bit about that as well as I talk about the sectoral impacts on agriculture and urbanization. But the first challenge, as I said, when we began to work on this topic was to try and change the narrative that growth and climate are actually not in conflict. And if you begin to address your subsidies, if you begin, not saying that you completely get rid of the subsidies, but if you begin to address some of the subsidies that end up in distorting the system and making you use fossil fuels, making you use electricity and water, etc., heavily subsidize that and use them, much more than you would in case they were priced properly, then we anyway need to do that. And climate would then, your environment benefits will come out as a co-benefit. So the framing, I think, is important, that you address policy. Well, hey, you'll get climate as a co-benefit. And I think that narrative now has begun to change in the country. And I'm really happy about that. And we are, in Delhi, you're fairly proximate with what's happening in the Environmental Ministry, in the Ministry for Agriculture. And you know what? And they're all thinking about, in silos, but they are thinking about how to adapt, how to mitigate, and how to begin to address these problems of climate change. And that's the positive thing that has happened. And why has that happened? Well, I think if I take an analogy with China, and I'll talk at the end of my talk, I'll give you an example of how we're working with China and how we can actually begin to engage with them for our own benefit. If you visited China in the last couple of years, maybe 4 years ago, in any of the cities that have English language papers, which one could read, there was not a day that went by in my multiple visits to China that there wasn't an editorial on air pollution and the health impacts of that. And every day, not only analysts, but journalists, they were civil society, were talking about the problem of air pollution. And that got the government to act, and they're acting very, very aggressively and positively on climate change. I'm not for a moment saying here that we adopt the manner in which China is going about it, but I think there's the trigger for the change that happened in China is not very different from what is happening in India today. Every day you see some newspaper either online or in print talking about climate and the negative impacts, the adverse impacts of air pollution on health, on water bodies, on agriculture, on lakes, on your biodiversity. And I think that's a good sign. And more people need to begin to do that. Which will then begin to change the narrative of this growth and climate being goals in conflict. And I don't think we should treat them at the policy level at goals that are in conflict. We shouldn't be too obsessive about growth, but we need growth because growth will then give us the revenues to be able to address the problems that we are facing with respect to the environment. So we need growth, but we needn't be too obsessive about growth. So that was really the framing of the agenda, and I'm happy to say, as I said, that change has begun to happen. Then I think there are two important other aspects of the climate agenda that are, that as in government lingua franca, they are seized off at the moment, and there are multiple more agendas, but I will speak about at least 2 or 3 of them that the government is actually taking head on. One you mentioned in the video, which is urbanization, and I'll try and develop that argument from an economist perspective, and then of course agriculture and hotspots. Urbanization is something, as I said, that came fairly late on the economic agenda, but I'm glad, better late than never. It's now squarely on the economic agenda. And we know through agglomeration economics, we know through urban economics that, urbanization or urban areas are the places where you're going to get your economic growth from. that where you're going to get your innovations from, where you're going to get your revenues from. That's where the jobs are going to be created. Now, if you say that I don't want all the 600 million people coming into the cities in the next decade, and I'll try and create public amenities in rural areas to try and stem the migration, I think that is a non-starter. That's a non sequitur. That's not going to happen. People are going to come to urban areas. There is going to be rapid urbanization in the country. Because why do people come to urban areas? The data on migration is beginning to now come alive in India. We are seeing much more data on urbanization. But I think that urbanization, the attraction of people coming from rural areas to urban areas, coming into cities, is really to benefit from the large labor pools that exist, the job market that exists, and that is going to continue to happen. And there's an agenda of in Delhi and the bigger cities, how to prevent the slums from growing, etc. And that's an important agenda, and that's a different agenda. But I think these people who come serve a huge economic function for people like you and me in the middle class who employ the services. But that's not an agenda that I want to pursue. But I think that migration is not going to stop. And therefore, that 600 million could very well be an underestimate. We could get many more people living in urban areas in the next few decades. Well, by the way, by the year 2030, India is going to become the most populous country in the world. By the year 2050, we will have 1 billion people living in India, 1 billion in the labor force, and 1.7 billion people in the country. So when you're talking about a labor force of 1 billion and a total population of 1.7 billion, you're obviously going to have to create jobs. And where are those jobs going to come from? Those jobs are not going to come from agriculture. Those jobs are going to come from non-agriculture sources, and those non-agriculture sources are most likely going to be in cities or peri-urban areas. And that's why I'm saying that the urban agenda is central to addressing the issue of climate change. And within the urban agenda, of course, not only jobs, within the urban agenda, you have a whole lot of services that are provided. And those services that are provided include transportation, and you know that living in Bangalore, how much of a problem that is. Those services include water and sanitation. The Niti Aayog released a paper just 2 weeks ago, saying that India is one of the most water-stressed countries in the world, and not difficult to see why. And those services include power and electricity. And the reason I'm mentioning just these 3 services is because we, along with the NCE, did a paper in looking at how are these services provided in urban areas like Bangalore, Surat, Kochi, Ludhiana, and Pune, Indore. So there were a few cities that we went out to do primary surveys from, and whatever data we could get from the municipal corporations we did get. But the point I wish to make is that these services are provided either by personal, private services, self-provision, or by public. There are 3 ways by which services are provided. And you think about yourselves. Do you travel by your own car? Do you travel by public transport? Or do you travel by a private, let's say, Uber or a taxi? I mean, these are 3 ways in which each of the services can be provided. And if we continue to provide these services, as we saw in our primary survey and through the analysis of secondary data, in what we call the business as usual urbanization, if we continue to provide the services in the manner we are providing them today, then I'm afraid we're not going to make enough of an impact on the environment and climate change. Because people who can afford it, the gated communities and so on, are providing for themselves by self-provision. So you dig your own water bore well, or you drive your own car, or you have your own generator. And these are much more harmful to the environment in terms of emissions than are other forms of provision. And the idea of this study was just to show, and I don't want to deliberate too much on this, the idea of the study was just to show if business as usual provision of services within urban centers continues, then unfortunately, we are not beginning to address our climate agenda. And we don't have to compromise growth to achieve the climate agenda while addressing the problem. We begin to need to provide better quality transport, public transports, like people like you and me, get off our cars and get into public transport. You know, you hear the usual stories. You hear them in Delhi, you probably hear them in Bangalore. And, well, if there's no public transport, there's last mile problems, then I'm going to use my private car. Of course, you can improve the standards of the car, you can improve the standards of the fuel, so you can address the emissions. But congestion is a major issue in cities as well. So we need to decongest our cities, we need to introduce better policies in our cities, and we need to ensure that municipalities are able to raise money so that they can invest in public transport and also capture land value from whatever they are investing in. And there's a very nice experiment that is happening in Delhi today in metros. I don't know if any of you have been to the IIT in Delhi. Opposite the IIT, there's a station which has come up, which is called, there was a court case on that, which has been auctioned to the highest bidder to put his, the firm's name on the station. And there was a confusion between the name of the station and IIT, and IIT took them to court. Anyway, that court back. But it's an example of how municipalities can begin to capture land value and thereby generate the resources to be able to invest in public services. And public transport is just one. But land value capture is something which is, I think we have achieved or underdone in India, and we should begin. It's not that we haven't done land value capture, but the kind of land value capture that we've done has been inimical to the provision of public goods. Or in other words, it's not been conducive to making investment in public goods, and that money has not gone to the right sources. But we can do that if we put our minds to it. That is something that can be done. And similarly, ditto for electricity, better quality electricity. Of course, the renewable agenda is there, and ditto for water and sanitation, etc. So the point is that business as usual is going to spell disaster for us, and we are going to only make it worse. So we need to change the way services are provided in cities. So business as usual urbanization. And as I said, urbanization, willy-nilly, you do what you like, is going to happen. And then there are, of course, the buildings that you need, that will exist in 2050. 70%, if you believe the McKinsey estimates, 70% of those buildings that will exist in urban India in 2050 have not yet been built. So then, the answer is simple, or the research question, and the answer is fairly simple. Why don't you lock yourself into low carbon technology rather than locking yourself into stranded assets and then not knowing how to get out of them? And there are examples of how also that exists, like coal is an example, but I will talk about coal because I think that is a major sort of policy conundrum on our agenda today. So that's the urban story. In a nutshell, I think urbanization is going to happen and we need to address it hands-on. And to be able to address the urban agenda, I think much more power has to be given to the municipalities in the country. We are right now engaged in a project, in a research study with the Finance Commission. Those of you who are aware, we now have the 15th Finance Commission in India on board, and the papers we are doing are linked to financing of municipalities and how municipalities can finance themselves. But just to give you a sense of how the municipal agenda can also further the climate agenda is, 42% of all revenue is now going to be given to the state without questions asked, and the states have to decide where they want to invest this money. So the states have been given flexibility, and if the states have been given flexibility to do this, that narrative of better climate, better growth needs to percolate down to the states as well. And we're trying to study where is this 42% that is being given to states, where are they spending their money? Are they spending it on salaries, or are they spending it on creating public goods that, that improve the environment, that improve the public. And the results of that study will be out in November. And I think it's important to be able to understand how states are spending that increased devolution that is happening from the center to the states. But that was an aside. Really, the municipalities and the panchayats in the rural areas need much more financing, much more power, much more decentralization. Imposing from above is not very good for achieving your policy goals, including your climate goals. The second area that I wanted to touch upon in terms of the climate sort of sectoral goals is agriculture. And the impact of, and I don't have to tell this audience that the impact of temperature rises, variability in rainfall, incessant droughts, and flooding, all of this will coexist. And the sector that is going to be affected disproportionately is going to be agriculture. And do you know that about 50%, while agriculture contributes only 15 to 16% of our GDP, it disproportionately contributes to livelihoods. And 50% of India almost is dependent on agriculture. So one of the things that, we have a very large agriculture team that works in ICRIER, and we're proud that we've put out, papers that have found a lot of traction, both at the national as well as the state level. And one of the things the researcher, Professor Ashok Gulati, you might have heard his name, who's an eminent researcher in agriculture, we often ask him in conversations is, how do you improve the productivity of agriculture? 16% contributing to 50%. Well, he says it's very simple. I mean, among other things, reduce the number of people who are dependent on agriculture, i.e. create more non-farm employment. And that, again, has an inextricable link to the urban agenda. But agriculture is going to be disproportionately, as I said, affected. And I think what is making the problem in India a little more kind of politically difficult to address is that we are now growing crops. Of course, there's transition to more protein and more fruits and more vegetables, but there's still a very large production of cereals, wheat and rice, and of course sugarcane, cotton, etc. And some of these crops are being grown, I'm told, in regions that they ought not to be grown, which are water-stressed regions. For example, sugarcane in Maharashtra or rice in Punjab really adds to the water stress, because when you're exporting from, let's say, Maharashtra, 1 ton of, I'm just using some examples, orders of magnitude, along with that 1 ton of sugarcane, you're actually exporting 3,000 liters of water. When you export from the Punjab 1 ton of rice, you're actually exporting 5,000 liters of water. But that's another example of sort of economic modeling, to use the Coasian sort of analogy. Those externalities are not accounted for because water is free, electricity is free, they're heavily subsidized. Not for a moment I'm saying that one fine day, in one fell swoop, you come and take away the subsidies. There can be a smooth transition. There is a direct benefit transfer scheme that exists today, so that smooth transition can be made. But unless we begin to address these problems, we are only going to lock ourselves into a much worse sort of future if we continue to grow, misallocate geographically, if we misallocate crops in regions where they ought not to be grown. Of course, it's very difficult. You've locked into a system. You've been doing it for so many years. There's inertia. There's a whole ecosystem around Punjab. There's a whole ecosystem around Maharashtra that caters to the sugarcane economy, that caters to the rice economy. So it's difficult. But there are other adaptive technologies that, sprinklers, etc., drip farming, all that is beginning to happen. But some bigger things also need to happen so that we can address, we can adapt to the growing sort of tendency of having variable climate and variable rainfall, especially in these areas. So, of course, the policy conclusions of this are fairly straightforward. The World Bank recently released a report jointly with ICRIER, in which they talked about climate hotspots. And climate hotspots are defined as those over the next few decades where, as a result of temperature rises, they are going to become much more vulnerable to, and it's not the coastal regions that are most vulnerable, it's these arid regions in Vidarbha, in Chhattisgarh, in Madhya Pradesh, where the variability in living standards is going to be much larger if the temperatures begin to rise, beyond they've done some scenario building, 2.5, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, and they find that those hotspots are the regions exactly where people are dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods. And those will be disproportionately affected. So the policy implications of that scenario modeling is that you need to build adaptive strategy. You need to basically irrigate a lot of the land, or a lot of the agricultural land, which the government is anyway trying to do, but also you need to create much more non-farm employment and improve the quality and outcomes of education in rural areas as well. So urbanization and agriculture, I think, services, of course now people say that manufacturing and services are inextricably linked. There's no distinction between manufacturing and services. But, looking at climate through the agenda or through the lens of urbanization and agriculture provides you with some insights. And I'm not saying that policymakers are ignorant of this. This is all sort of has been known, it's on the table. Different research institutes all over the country, all over the world are helping the government of India in designing, formulating its policies. But as I said, one of the problems is the lock-in that has happened and, of course, the implementation. There are two more points that I would like to address, and my TV monitor is saying that the time is up, and I think I have just two more points to make, and then I will stop. One has to do with carbon pricing and coal, and I think that's an agenda that will be on the table in India for a long, long time, and I think it's a difficult sort of nut to crack, and this is one of the most vexing sort of things. There's pressures from international community. Of course, there are domestic, the resource endowment for India. Every country grows with its comparative advantage. What is India's comparative advantage? India's comparative advantage, of course, is large endowments of coal and a whole community that is dependent on coal, right? So how do we sort of get out of coal and into non-coal or renewable energy future? That's beginning to happen. We've committed in Paris that we are going to, up the percentage of renewables to 40% by 2030, that renewable energy. But in all plausible scenarios, including those done by India, including those done by the International Energy Agency, coal remains between 60 to 65% of India's primary energy needs. And therefore, are we going to look at a future which will be dominated by, dirty coal, or that could be dominated by clean coal? A lot of, climate activists say that clean coal is an oxymoron. You can't have coal that is clean. And I'm not going to pass judgment on that because I'm not an engineer, I'm not a technologist. But to the extent that you can look at technologies that help improve the emissions or reduce the emissions from coal, then India should look at that options. Given that, as I said, in all your scenarios, all your modeling, coal remains extremely dominant. The other is on carbon pricing. What should the appropriate optimal price for or the tax on coal be? We already have a 400 rupee per ton tax on coal, which is in place, which has been doubled and doubled and redoubled in successive budgets, and that is used for clean energy investments. Now that could be increased, but by any standard, we can't up that to 6,000 or 7,000 rupees per ton. It'll be difficult for us to go up to that level. Is pricing the only tool? Well, economists say that pricing is one of the most important tools to begin to address allocation of resources. We need to price coal correctly. What that price of carbon is, I don't know, but this is an agenda that we need to resolve. Coal, carbon pricing is an agenda that we need to resolve. And I don't think that it's on the table, but it's much far away from resolution compared to the other agendas that we have on the table. And the last point I wish to make is, again, it's related to the pressures that international communities are put on India, especially on coal and carbon pricing. As I said, ICRIER is very much involved in some of those track twos and negotiations. We, in fact, are, even as we speak, we have a track two dialogue with China that happens every year, and we are discussing with China. Now, what China has done is that it is, in a manner of speaking, using the metaphor, they've taken the bull by the horns and are very aggressive on climate change, and we're trying to learn what we can from China. And lessons. Given the global geopolitical environment that exists today, given that the West is unlikely, I think, to meet its obligations that it had promised to emerging countries, both in terms of financial as well as technology, I don't think we should be sort of naive to believe that this is going to happen in the manner that was promised a decade ago. But if the West is sort of moving away from its commitment, and I have one country squarely in my mind when I say that, can this agenda be sort of taken up? I'm talking about very large geopolitical. Can we partner with China and begin to look at clean technologies, solar panels? Can China and India begin to work together on this agenda? And I think if we are able to do that, then there could be a breakthrough. And it could happen, of course, not at the track two level, which we are engaged in, but it'll have to happen at a much higher level. But there is an opportunity for India and China to come together and take the lead on climate like there was never before. There are several other agendas, of course, on trade, etc. But this is an agenda, I think, that we can work together, given that both the countries are going to be the largest, in a sense, incremental users of the carbon space in the future. Of course, China by far more, but India will get there, and we will use that carbon space. And can we use our sort of collaboration and partnership to begin to address domestic agenda? And it's not that we haven't not used our international commitments to address domestic agendas. I mean, that we've done. Of course, we are now in a position to frame international agendas rather than take domestic agenda, the domestic agenda to follow the international agenda. But here is a moment, as I said, in time when we can partner and begin to address some of our domestic agendas relating to not only climate, as I said, which could come out as a co-benefit, but also on growth, on jobs, because China has sort of a lead in the sense that it started this agenda much before us, and there are several things that we can learn from the way the urbanization in cities and their growth has gone in the last few years. I know I'm over time, but thank you very much for listening to me. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Doctor, we request you to kindly stay glued on stage. We request Mr. Anil Padmanabhan to kindly join us to give a small token of appreciation. Yes. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much, Doctor, for sharing your thoughts on this. A louder round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Doctor. Thank you. Thank you once again. Moving ahead, ladies and gentlemen, now it's time for us to invite on stage Mr. Ravichandran Purushothaman, the President from Danfoss, India, for a special address for all of us. A thunder of applause, ladies and gentlemen, as we welcome Mr. Ravichandran Purushothaman on stage. Very warm welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Firstly, before I start, I would like to thank Anil and Swati for taking this journey from food to energy to infrastructure, and finally here culminating here in an important topic, which is climate change. I think I would also like to thank the entire Mint team for having co-created this great opportunity to be partnering this. I will talk a little bit about climate change from a different context. When I stand before you, I represent a company which has been in the existence for more than 86, 87 years. And we have been making products which helped economies, companies decouple growth and the classical energy intensity problems actually. That's pretty much what you talked about. I picked that from Mr. Rajat's talk, in fact, that I think both growth and climate are always in conflict. Therefore, I think when we look at, as a company, I think we have evolved many of these technologies over the last 8 decades. And currently we work on 4 strategic agendas: clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy for all, sustainable cities and communities, and lastly, responsible consumption and production. I think in this context, I think we have created a factory in Chennai, which we are looking at making it carbon neutral in the next 5 years actually as an enterprise, as a production enterprises. Moving on to the second thing that I wanted to talk about is, which is very closely related to climate change, is about cooling. Many of the narratives across the world about cooling is really the Cinderella of the energy debate. Why we say so? Because it is estimated that the world cooling energy requirement is going to grow 33-fold by the year 2100. And of course, we all know that air conditioning is a vicious cycle, because when you look at air conditioning, the traditional technology that exists for more than 100 years is compression of the vapors, which is clearly what air conditioning is all about. Technology hasn't changed, but I think what we do with the technology has changed quite dramatically. When you talk about cooling today, we have fundamentally 3 parts to the vicious cycle. One is you need a lot of energy to actually run a cooling system. Second, that energy is basically using a lot of refrigerant. That refrigerant is actually throwing a lot of heat into the atmosphere because of its natural process of expansion and cooling. So that's another thing that is heating up the environment. And I think the third most important thing is that with more and more urbanization that is happening, we clearly see that more hot air is actually thrown in the cities. Typically, to give you an example, the amount of electricity demand that is coming from cooling in United States, just cooling in United States, is equal to the entire energy consumption of Africa. If you look at the demand of electricity that is needed in the city of Mumbai, 40% of the electricity generation is actually going for cooling in Mumbai, and it's 50% in Delhi. In fact, the swings because of cooling is very, very phenomenally, very, very high actually. So that's why I think this whole discussion of cooling becoming the Cinderella of energy debate is never going to end. But clearly, what is the solution ahead for us? I think if you look at India, India today produces 1.5 million of residential air conditioners, and the business of residential air conditioners is growing about 15%. China is today producing 6 million residential air conditioners actually. But as Mr. Rajat was pointing out, China has actually adopted different approach to solving their cooling problem. They've actually moved away towards a higher energy efficiency norms. They've also moved into newer technologies, like they have literally used heat pump, district cooling, district heating as newer technologies, and completely disrupted their energy footprint actually. So there are technologies that are available today in the world which helps us to decouple energy intensity and economic growth. But I think what is important here is to put the policy framework in place and look at how to implement them in a larger context of urbanization. I think we at Danfoss are a firm believer that technologies like district cooling, technologies like using newer refrigerants, especially CO2, ammonia, we can actually disrupt a lot of the global warming potential that exists or that is going to be created by the future demand that comes up actually. I think India is clearly at a cusp where this inflection is going to happen in terms of urbanization. And I see climate change in India as a great opportunity, a global opportunity, and a potential game changer, which actually coupled with the Make in India objective that India has, I think we are poised to really become the manufacturing powerhouse for clean technologies for the world. And I think that's the narrative at which I would stop. And I think this is where we have a great potential to make a difference, not just to the economic development of India, but also, I believe, to make a difference to a cooler planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your words of wisdom. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to begin our panel discussion with industry experts on the topic, India's climate imperatives. And please do join our conversation on Twitter if you haven't by hashtagging us, which is Transformation Agenda, and you can also tag us on Mint Conclaves. Please put your hands together as I welcome the panelists on stage. Let's welcome our first panelist, Mr. J. Srinivasan, Distinguished Scientist, Duvecha Center for Climate Change from IISc, to join us on stage, please. Let's welcome Mr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy, the Senior Fellow from Ashoka Trust for Ecology and Environment, to join us on stage. Let's welcome Mr. Aroma Ravi, the Director from Indian Institute for Human Settlements from IIHS, to join us on stage. And let's welcome our last panelist, Ms. Ulka Kelkar, the Senior Climate Policy Lead from World Resources Institute, WRI, India, to join us on stage. And put your hands together as we invite our infrastructure editor from Mint, our moderator, Mr. Utpal Bhaskar, to moderate the session for all of us.
Thanks a lot. Let me take this opportunity first to thank Rajat for framing the idea so well. In fact, he has actually traced the contours of what the problems are and the probable solutions around. And I'm very thankful to this very distinguished panel for sharing this evening with us. There cannot be a panel better than this. This is absolutely a fabulous panel to discuss the issues of the day. In fact, also the city of Bangalore, as Anil rightly pointed out, lends itself perfectly for some of these, it provides a setting for some of these challenges that India and the cities are facing. Without much further ado, I would like to introduce the panel and then dwell into some of the issues which have been talked about. So we have with us with Professor J. Srinivasan, who's a distinguished scientist, Duvecha Center for Climate Change at Indian Institute of Science. He is a PhD from Stanford and has an exhaustive experience, ladies and gentlemen, on climate-related issues. In fact, he was also the lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 4th Assessment Report. We also have with us Dr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy. He's a Senior Fellow, Ashoka Trust for Ecology and the Environment. He has a PhD in Environmental Studies from Duke University, and he was instrumental in declaration of Western Ghats as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Thanks for being here. We have with us Ms. Ulka Kelkar. She's a Senior Climate Policy Lead, World Resources Institute, India. She's an economist and was earlier with TERI, where her focus areas being climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. Last but not least, Mr. Aroma Ravi. He's a director in Institute for Human Settlements. He's an alumnus of IIT Delhi and a world-renowned urban scholar. He was member of the Sivaramakrishnan Committee and also helped identify options for a new state capital of Andhra Pradesh. So, as most of you, as all of you here, I'm here to listen to this eminent stalwarts. So this is how this will flow. There will be a panel discussion, post which I'll be opening up for the questions. And so my first, I'll be posing it to Professor Srinivasan. So your views on it, please. And these are initial opening statements from the panelists. So I would invite them to make a 3-minute kind of a statement, and then we will be, and I would also hope the panelists to join issues then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First, I want to say a few words about a confusion that exists about climate. There are really 3 important issues. One is global climate change. The second is local climate change. And the third is environmental change. The 3 have to be treated separately because the kind of solutions you look for are different, depending on which you're talking about. But both in the media and among public as well as politicians, there's a confusion among them. Global climate change is something about which we in India cannot do much. We contribute 6% to the global CO2 emissions. So what we do or don't do in the next 20 years will hardly matter. The second is a local climate change, which in a city like Bangalore, we have seen dramatically. If we take the month of March, the mean temperature in Bangalore went up by 2 degrees centigrade, while at the same time, the global temperature went up by 1 degree. So half the warming of Bangalore was our own creation. And this can be solved locally. We don't have to go to Paris or to New York to solve it. But we've not done it. Okay. The last issue is environmental change, which is linked to climate, but it's also independent of climate. For example, air pollution is not a climate problem. Air pollution is a very local problem. It's killing 1 million Indians prematurely every year, and we're not even talking about it. We are thinking that as a nuisance, not as a problem. Water pollution is again a local problem, can be tackled with local solution, and of course water shortage. Now, to me, for a country like India, which is assured of very reliable rainfall from monsoon, to talk of India being water stressed implies that we didn't do our job right. We let our population go up 4 times in the last 70 years, and the way we manage water is useless. But none of these are to do with global climate change. And the second issue is already raised about sea level rise. Sea level rise is a serious issue for India because we have a large coastline. But let me assure you that the major problem is not global warming. If you look at the problem, let's say in Bangladesh and West Bengal, the rate of sea level rise due to global warming is about 3 millimeters per year. But the rate of sinking of the land is 10 to 12 millimeters per year. So the issue is again local, not global. And the sinking is occurring because of groundwater depletion, because of building of dams. So those, again, have to solve locally. So this issue, to separate the local and the global necessary. And again, the other point raised in Katuria's talk is about how economists have used climate models to predict what will happen in various parts of India. We work on climate models. I don't trust them on a local scale. Unfortunately, in spite of all the research we have done, in spite of enormous computing power, we cannot predict local climate change very easily. So whatever outputs are coming out are not reliable. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
So very important thoughts there. So it's, and the distinction between local and global. I would like Dr. Krishnaswamy to present his views.
Regarding the biodiversity, ecosystems and ecology aspect of the climate change debate, if we talk to any of our colleagues who are working actually in the area of biodiversity and conservation, climate change would be very low in terms of the stressors that biodiversity faces. And rightfully so, if you look at the ecosystems that we have in India, they have undergone, in terms of climate variability and climate change, they have managed to persist over hundreds of years, including episodes of severe droughts, extreme events, and so on. So the major threat to ecosystems and biodiversity continues to be land use and land cover change. I will get to the additional stress that climate change is going to impose, but nevertheless, I think if we have to, whether it in terms of future climate, all our options would be closed if we actually do not remove the other stressors on biodiversity and ecosystems, which is the changes in land use and land cover. And even when we talk about mitigation, if you look at what's happening, so for example, large solar farms are being situated in semi-arid areas. And these are the last remaining habitats for a variety of species and for certain types of livelihoods and so on. When we talk about small dams in the Western Ghats, they are having tremendous negative impacts on native fish biodiversity. So again, it's a transformation of the landscape or the waterscape. So we'll have to come to the basics in terms of the impacts on biodiversity and our forest ecosystems. Climate change is going to be an additional stressor. We can see that especially in certain ecosystems. For example, in the Himalayas, certainly the warming is inducing a temperature-induced moisture stress. We are already seeing, but the options for habitats, they're no longer connected very well. It's difficult for species to disperse and so on. So actually the real stressors is the lack is the disruption of the connectivity, the transformation of the landscape, which has very little to do with climate change. And so I think that before we start even thinking about what climate change is likely to do to our biodiversity and ecosystems, we need to think about the other stressors, where even sometimes we find that even the mitigation measures are adding to the same type of transformations that have actually led to the depletion of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I'll end here for the time being.
Yeah. Important point there. Mr. Ravi.
Thanks. I guess I'd open by saying that we're confused. In fact, I think we're desperately confused. What I've heard my compatriots say just now, in some senses, is not very different from what you hear from other parts of the world, and that is that climate is not a significant issue. I would say that that's very, very far from the fact. And where am I saying that from? I've just spent 18 months leading a set of 70 authors to produce probably the most important report that will come out this year on climate change, in fact, on implementing the Paris Accord. So what are the facts? The first fact is that we are, from last year, 1 degree above the pre-industrial average. That's what the global average temperature is like. And exactly as Professor Srinivasan says, the local effects are significantly higher, both in the higher latitudes. You go to the north and see what's happening in Antarctica, and in high altitudes. But as far as India is concerned, our temperatures, especially in cities, are significantly higher. So if you look at mean temperature elevations, climate change is already here. It may not be here for 365 days of the year, but it's here for a certain number of days, and those number of days are actually increasing in time. So that's, the mean average temperatures are growing at 0.2 degrees plus minus 0.1 degrees per decade, which basically means that we will have an overshoot over 1.5 degrees Celsius in a much shorter period of time than we thought of. The question in Paris is actually not a 2-degree question. The question in Paris that was debated was about being well below 2 degrees and actually being closer to 1.5. Because when we wrote the R5 report, I was a coordinating lead author on the chapter on urban areas. The question was that 2 degrees was too much. The impacts, especially on poor people in poor countries, is very extreme. And in fact, that is sort of the threshold of the dangerous climate change. The third fact that we should all know, and India is complicit in this, is that the NDCs that we signed in Paris do not take you to 2. They take you between 2.75 and 3. And 2.75 and 3 is completely unimaginable in a country of our size and scale. So those are the critical 3 facts that we must remember. We are headed, business as usual or otherwise, for an overshoot over 1.5. We don't know how long it will last, we don't know how much it will be, but that overshoot is almost certain. And that is why, and this is why I'm going to be a little contrarian here, climate is not only a local environmental issue, it's a global one, exactly as Professor climate change, at least at that scale, is very critical. For India, This is a national security question at one end. It's also a critical sustainable development question. I'll pick that up later, both those 2 points. There's lots of facts to look at them. Because we are one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, and the vulnerability is not of 5 and 10 million people. The vulnerability, as Rajat has talked about, they worked on that report just now, is of the order of hundreds of millions of people in this economic transition as we move from an agrarian economy to one that's not agrarian. And I'll just give you some sense of scale. In the last 100 years, the 3 most important extreme events that this subcontinent has seen. 1918, 1918, 15 million people died in the flu epidemic. 1947, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people died. About 15 million people were displaced by partition. 1971, 10 million people displaced in Bangladesh, somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million people who died. The climate impacts that we expect to see here, if we don't make rapid change, not only in India but across the world, are of the order of displacement of hundreds of millions of people. The difference, of course, it won't happen over 1 or 2 years like partition. It might happen over a decade or more. This is a serious existential question, not only for enterprises, but for the existence of this country over the next 15 or 20 years.
Thank you. Scary thoughts there. I would like Ulka to weigh in here.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the way I was thinking about, listening to my fellow panelists, I see that there is a kind of 2 ways of thinking about it. One is you have India's climate imperatives that are the outcome of negotiation, so the Paris Accords and so on. And then there are the imperatives that must come out as an outcome of our introspection. So what is it that I care about? My children's health. I worry about the safety of my father when he crosses the road on a very busy highway. We have a nostalgia for the past, and we have an excitement for the future. And since this event is called Transformation Agenda, what is it that we want to transform into? Singapore, or Beijing, or the Bangalore of the past? And who gets to decide? So this is really the way I am sort of seeing the connection, or the lack of connection, between climate imperatives and what Mr. Kathuria called co-benefits in his talk. And one thing that I would disagree with the way the sort of argument has been framed is I would like us to go beyond this sense of fear. Urgency is a very good thing. It's very good to feel that. But fear often leads us to wrong decisions. So instead, I'd like to talk about 3 points from a slightly more positive perspective, let me put it. One is the issue of water. I belong to a research institute called WRI, World Resources Institute, and we recently did a study, my colleagues, where we looked at India's thermal power generation. Thermal or nuclear requires fresh water for cooling. And what happens is that as India's power generation increased by, say, 40% between 2011 to 2016, the fresh water consumption also increased by 40% over the same period. And instead, if you were to be able to meet the renewable energy targets that India has laid out, whether as part of its INDC or otherwise, you'd be able to moderate that fresh water consumption at less than 2016 levels. Instead, what you have is that out of, I think something like 14 thermal power plants reported that between 2013 and 2016, they had at least 1 shutdown because of water shortages. And this led to revenue losses of 9,000 crores. So the choice is quite stark. The second point I want to talk about is rooftop solar photovoltaic. Again, solar has been a big success story. And rooftop solar photovoltaic makes sense for the consumers who install it on their rooftops. It makes financial sense. It makes ecological sense because you're not putting large solar. Thank you very much. It's a substitute for large solar farms in ecologically rich grasslands. And it also makes sense for the utility because you're less T&D losses because you're sort of bringing power that were less sort of closer to the point of use. But if you look at what has driven this success story, it has basically been because of economies of scale. Price coming down because of mass production of silicon cells. The opportunity here is for transformational change, either in terms of storage technology or in terms of the efficiency of the solar cells. There's also an opportunity for cross-border trade. The issue of the past, the constraint of the traditional electricity system used to be scarcity. Now the issue is variability or reliability as you have more and more renewables coming in. So if you could have a cross-border trade, a cross-border grid with Bangladesh and Nepal, you're addressing issues, not just green issues of carbon, but also of energy access for some of the areas which most need electricity. The third, if I may quickly tell you a little story and bring it back to the personal issue that I started with. There's a TED talk by a doctor and statistician, Swedish man called Hans Rosling, where he talks about the washing machine as a magic machine. And he says that, when his grandmother first saw a washing machine, she sat in front of it and watched the entire cycle of laundry being washed because she had always washed clothes by hand. And he says his mother, and he demonstrates this in the TED talk, he puts in a load of laundry, and out of it comes a library book. And he said, this machine freed up my mother, and she could now read to me. She could take me to the library. So there is a very strong connection between low carbon emissions, energy efficiency, however you want to portray it or look at it, and social development, women's work in particular. And it's really important because when you look at low carbon emissions or you set targets, who is the burden falling on is a very important thing to keep in mind. So I'll just stop there.
A very important point about India's emerging green economy. There's a lot of focus which has been put there. So we'll come to all these issues in a short while. This is something which I wanted to take off from what Dr. Kasuria said. So what is the trade-off between environment and growth? That's a very important point. In fact, the way that, as he rightly talked about, the way that the narrative has been framed, I would want to start with Aroma to weigh in there. How does this go? Is it a very is a question which is there? I know it's not a very easy question, but what is the trade-off there, and how do we see India progressing on that count?
Well, I think it's false to set it up as a trade-off between environment and growth. I think the whole framework of sustainable development that India is a signatory to actually helps reconcile those questions. The central question, like I just laid out just now, for us is a question of employment. It's a question of actual structural transformation of the economy. We are actually a very low carbon economy. So for us, in some senses, we have a great way to go if we don't actually hold on with both hands to a framework that doesn't work for us in some senses. And we are a low carbon economy with half the employment coming in the agricultural sector. So there are tremendous opportunities for us to transition. But the challenge for us, of course, is we are locked in at the current point of time into a coal-based energy system. So within that, our first and most important challenge is we have to end energy poverty. You cannot provide the jobs that we have, especially in northern India and many other parts of the country, unless you end energy poverty in the villages. Which means if you're going the current way, you're going to be locked into an even deeper path as far as carbon is concerned. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to do that along with high degrees of energy efficiency. And there's lots of opportunity as far as that's concerned, and move to renewables. But if we are stuck with the current utility model that we have, which is bleeding all the time, it will not work. So the restructuring of the energy sector, of the utility sector, is absolutely one of the most difficult political problems that we have. So there are four critical transformations that India has to engage in. The first one is the energy sector transformation, which has many elements to it. But I would say the most difficult one is the power sector reform that we tried in the 90s and has not happened effectively just now. The second one is what Jagdish talked about, which is a land use transformation that includes in that the production of food and biomass and the trade-offs there between water security and food security. The fourth one, the third one that Rajat pointed out, is the question of urbanization. We are adopting a highly energy-intensive form of urbanization. We don't have to do that. If we're going to run into air conditioners for even quarter of the population, not only is urban Italian going to kill us, but it's going to become completely unsustainable. We have to fundamentally change that. And finally, because we're an economy that's growing so rapidly, and we're going to use a lot of physical goods and resources, there needs to be an industrial transformation so that even our industrial sector, whether it's cement or steel or otherwise, needs to decarbonize simultaneously. The challenge for us is we have to do all those four things in the next 20 years because we're going to be one of the most significantly impacted countries. And that, I think, is the big policy conundrum. How does one build the governance, the investment frame, et cetera, to make that actually happen? And that implementation story is true. That's where the real trade-off is. It really sits within our our political economy and our policy systems and our incentive structures.
Very complex issues here because some of the stuff that you're talking about, in fact, I think reams have been talked about and written about it. Power sector reforms is something which I think every successive government has been trying to toy with. Discoms are in a huge mess right now, no matter what Uday or such schemes are being talked about. I would like Professor Srinivasan to weigh in here. Sir, what is your views on this? Is it I know it's as I said earlier, it's a complex subject, but there has to be a way out. It cannot be one of those things that can only be debated at times. At some point of time, action is required and it's imperative.
I just want to add one comment both Ben Aroma as well as Ravichandra Purushottam, that increasing cooling load will generate more heat. Although that is true, but what people don't realize is the amount of waste industry produces today is 1/100th of the amount of heat trapped by CO2. So the comparison, CO2 trapping heat cannot be seen. So none of us are aware of it, but the waste heat generated is trivial compared to the CO2 heat trap. So one has to focus on controlling CO2 because that is much, much bigger than waste heat problem.
Right.
And the other issue that I would like to highlight here is that Rajat Kathuria talked about coal being our endowed this one. I think coal is a curse for India for two reasons. One is a low quality coal, second is under the forest. And we are removing forest to get the coal. So I think we should have, at the time of independence, not gone towards coal but towards solar. As a matter of fact, there was a big debate between Baba and Saha on this issue in the parliament. But unfortunately, Saha lost the battle. Saha argued for solar in 1947.
Wow.
And nobody believed him. And I hope that thing is now rectified.
Yeah, we had BEL doing, the most radical work here in the 80s.
So thank you for that. In fact, given that you spoke about solar, I think India has one of the lowest tariffs right now. It's one of the most competitive tariffs. But at some level, it is also adding to the pain in the system as well. So because what is now happening is, as you said, that we are committed to a coal-based architecture on the energy front. A lot of these coal assets which are out there are also being pushed out of this of the tariff orders as well, primarily because solar and wind are taking them they're absolutely wiping them out. But the problem also with these two, and I'll come to that in a second, is also because solar and wind are infirm sources of power. Now, what do you do in a country like ours, which has got such a huge base load, and you need something to kind of balance it as well? Hydro has not come in the way, and that's exactly where I would like you to jump in. Hydro has not come in the way that it was supposed to be the balancing act that would meet the peak part of it. So, not very easy stuff happening on clean tech as well.
But I want to add that what Ulka mentioned, the cost of storage by battery is going down dramatically.
Right.
It is going, all of us have a UPS at home. If they're all connected, the amount of storage that is enormous.
Right.
And Australia already has done that. Only our battery storage is old-fashioned lead acid, which is unfortunate. If you go to lithium ion, every house can have a storage system, which will take care of power cuts, will take care of everything. But that will take some 10 years to transition.
Sir, I would just like to add to that. So lithium as a business, when we have been talking about, India doesn't have lithium. The play for lithium has already happened in Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. As Dr. Kathuria said, of course, I think this is the time when we need to reach out to China because Chinese are the ones who have actually cornered all those mines there. So, yeah, there is obviously, when we talk about even electric vehicles today, a lot of EVs are being looked at a part that they would help in, at some level, balancing as well. I would like you to come in, Dr. Jagdish. This conundrum, the conundrum between environment and growth, you have worked very closely. You have seen how this has created all kind of problems in the areas that you have worked. Your views on the same?
Yeah. The reason why I mentioned land transformation metrics as an important lens is not because that climate change is not going to add a lot of stress, and some of it are very uncertain at this moment what it's likely to do. It might even destroy entire ecosystems. But the thing is that the other stressors that we have on our biodiversity and ecosystems are sometimes downplayed when climate change debates happen.
All right.
And if you ask any conservationist who works at the local or regional scales about what's the threat to aquatic biodiversity in India, what's the threat to some of our large mammals, or of the great Indian bustard, or for many of our endangered tree species, climate change will not immediately come to their mind. And the thing is that there's other stressors in terms of overexploitation of the species or the transformation of the habitats. Those are processes that we will have to manage if we have to adapt, if these ecosystems have to adapt, if novel ecosystems have to emerge where we can have new types of livelihoods and new types of economic opportunities. So it is in that light that I think we should not forget about the other stressors. So if whatever we have done to our rivers, our forests and all, has been because of these other stressors and not because of climate change as yet. So that is one thing. So which means that we have to continue working on those stressors in the long term for us to be able to adapt to climate change. The second thing is that we are seeing certain types of transformations that we have to manage. So India is getting urbanized a lot. Now, how do you manage biodiversity, especially biodiversity that needs to move from one patch of forest or one patch of habitat to another, when you have 8-lane highways, when you have cities and towns mushrooming all over. Right. So we really now need to think very smartly about how urbanization, linear intrusions, and biodiversity can coexist. And it'll have to be a combination of land sharing and land sparing approaches.
All right.
At multiple scales. So that is, I think, something that can potentially, if done smartly, can generate a lot of jobs. The Green India mission is about transforming 10 million hectares, restoring. It's very carbon centric. Now, if we make that into an ecological restoration that promotes connectivity ecological connectivity between habitats, in spite of or with planned urbanization, I think that would again, I think a lot of knowledge, new types of knowledge needs to be generated and used for that type of management of. On the energy side, I think whether it's renewable energy with small scale hydroelectric or solar, we need to now think about whether we can have mitigation or other types of management to reduce or minimize the impacts on collateral damage on biodiversity and local livelihoods. And these are, I think, again, opportunities for employment as well, because we need to think about adaptation and mitigation as also creating a lot of jobs, both in rural as well as urban environments.
Absolutely, and hence the point about equitable distribution of resources as well. There cannot be a situation where, and obviously this government, of course, successive governments have been talking about jobs, and but we have also seen that while the growth imperatives are out there, a lot of times we have seen growth happening, but there's no job creation happening as well, because while growth has actually taken off in some sectors, it's a kind of a jobless growth. As a topic, I believe a publication have been flagging that for some time now. I would like Ulka to come in. Where do you see this conundrum finally settling down? Because there has to be a way out. It cannot be one of those esoteric debates all the time. It has to be some kind of a forward movement should be happening on it. There should be some kind of, there's some traction somewhere. But in your view, where do you see this going?
So I'd like to again, it's a big question, many different parts to the answer. I'd like to highlight perhaps just two of them. One is that, there is a lot of energy in this room. There's a lot of, everybody loves a good startup in Bangalore. This will be the capital. So there's a lot of faith that is placed in specific technology solutions. But as I think our panelists have pointed out, that is only just a piece of the puzzle. The story is much larger than that. These technological solutions are embedded in a larger governance landscape, and that itself is part of a cultural or lifestyle itself. So I'd like to talk about two things at the two ends of the spectrum. So one is a lot of it is left to, say, those who are actually the most vulnerable. That is, if you leave it to the community, decentralization, for example. And there's something very much to be said for that. But that alone will not take care of the issue. So there is this a comedian called Trevor Noah. I don't know how many of you watch Trevor Noah on the Daily Show, right? And he has grown up in poverty and apartheid, right? And he talks in his book, Born a Crime, about this very typical sort of proverb. Give a man a fish and you feed him for the day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for the lifetime. But then he says, you also give him a fishing rod and teach him how to use it. And that's really the importance of larger policy support, of capital, and of know-how. Otherwise, that connection between what's happening at the grassroots scale, the small scale, the larger upscaling that we want won't happen. The second point I want to talk about is really, again, at the sort of larger end of the spectrum, which is the issue of behavioral changes or lifestyle changes. I was at an event the WRI organized recently called Unlock Bengaluru, and there was a developers dialogue, all these gated communities that are coming up. And somebody said, a builder doesn't just sell you a building, he sells you a lifestyle. So how are we actually appreciating or understanding the aspirations of people and how those are changing, and using policies to actually design incentives that appeal to people's true motivations? And there are examples of this. For example, people are willing to go in for renewable energy when they purchase a new home. There are some natural trigger points at which people are willing to break away from the status quo. And that's when, if you can bundle in rooftop solar photovoltaic, for instance, into the housing loan for a new home, that's where you can actually make a change, or the transformation as you talk about it.
Interesting thought there. In fact, if I'm not wrong, at one point of time, state-owned banks are actually looking at it. I don't know what happened after that. But given that, and you mentioned Bangalore, and I can't help but ask this question, and you're all residents of this beautiful city. How has Bangalore coped with these changes? In the sense, we keep on reading about it, and when you look at the crisis of urbanization as well, how has Bangalore coped? And do you think that there is some, of course, there's a lot of thought out there about this gloom and doom, but I'm sure there's something good would have been happening as well. I would like Aroma to your views on this. Has Bangalore done something which there have been some kind of examples out there that other cities perhaps can possibly follow?
Well, Bangalore's struggling, and we're talking a lot about temperature, and frankly, this is because climate change has been looked at from temperate climates where temperature is a critical thing. For India, the critical issue is water. Right. Bangalore's struggling and will continue to struggle on water. I think the really interesting thing that may happen is if we're able to transform our water management for the city. The city itself cannot do it. It has to be handled regionally. And exactly as Ulka is saying, it has to start really at the lifestyle end of things. We have to be able to bring down water consumption to 70 liters per capita and reduce inequality across the city, because half the city is currently being fed by tankers, whether it's high-rise apartments in one place or poor people. So water is where, if Bangalore is able to really crack that problem, it's going to grow and develop. And if it doesn't, it's going to be, we have lots of examples of stuff as far as that's concerned. I think the metro is a beginning for that, because I think one very clear thing that we know from cities across the world is that you need to shrink footprints and not adopt what Houston and the West have done and everybody else is going in the other direction for. You need to condense footprints. Bangalore actually is like a donut. The center of the city is at very low intensity of densities. Outside the city is growing very rapidly. It's got an urban structure that doesn't work for us. We have to move to a much more livable, walkable city, and we've got the best climate that you can ask for. So you have a wonderful opportunity here not to go into air conditioning, to use public transport if it worked, but that means changing of spatial structure, which means you get into a very, very deep and challenging question, planning and land use and real estate, which of course is Bangalore's kind of Achilles heel in some senses. So very interesting opportunities here, a long way to go. There are very good examples from across the world in doing this thing. We've got great tech people here doing stuff. There are huge opportunities here, like we said just now, in dealing with expansion of renewable technology. This is a clean city. No dirty manufacturing, so solar cell kind of stuff can be brought here, and energy storage. Right. India's Achilles heel is energy storage. We have the best science in the world here, on the nanotech side and otherwise. But if we're able to build billion-dollar companies that can do energy storage, we will neither be dependent on the West, or frankly, to be very frank, on China. Because this transition that we're talking about on the energy side is a transition from the single largest industry that we know today, the oil, gas, and the coal industry, to renewables one. And by the way, who's the country that actually controls the emerging space? China. 70% of photovoltaics, 60% of wind, manufactured by Chinese companies, financed by $1 trillion credit line. The other word for that is one belt, one road.
So, in fact, also, just to add to it, and I'll come to you, when you're talking about even storage, I think if that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think even that play has already taken off far from us now. The Chinese, as I said earlier, Chinese have cornered the lithium mines. And why to play God here? There can be other technologies as well apart from lithium. So rather than betting on lithium and then kind of adding up to that kind of a valuation in those markets as well, I'm sure that given that technology is evolving, there can be better options available out there. Sorry, you were saying something here.
Just on the water side, I mean, if we just take the case of Bangalore, I mean, some of the options being is, of course, taking more water from the Kaveri, which is already a stress system, or even bringing water from the Linganimaki reservoir and so on. And there's this existing paradigm that, any river reaching the sea is a waste of water, any river reaching the Bay of Bengal or the Arabian Sea is a waste of water and so on. That paradigm needs to be challenged because the coastal areas and our marine ecosystems require fresh water, sediments, and nutrients reaching them. And we have always been talking about livelihoods based on agriculture, some of it based on water-intensive crops and so on. But also there are a lot of, in order to adapt to a future climate, you also need diversity of livelihoods, which are, marine fisheries, artisanal fisheries in rivers. You need other types of mangrove-based, economies. So these are, I think, something that we will have to build into the resilience in terms of both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So for example, Bangalore, I mean, it has if you look at the water story and as well as the greens. So actually, Bangalore, about 150 years ago, had far fewer trees than it has now. The trees that we now see in Bangalore are a very recent phenomena, partly subsidized by the water that has been brought into the system as well. Now that the trees are a part and these wooded spaces are part of our environment, obviously it gives us a good option for in terms of cooling and so on. So we definitely need to think about urbanization in a very different way. We have Bannerghatta National Park, which is a green lung for Bangalore, a tremendous opportunity to link the recreational, microclimatic regulation and environmental needs of Bangalore to a conservation issue. So in some sense, we need to raise the profile of green spaces in and around Bangalore in terms of improving the quality of life for people in Bangalore in the long term.
Right.
So that connection we need to build both in economically as well as in terms of knowledge and awareness generation.
Right. Professor Srinivasan, you have been a long-time resident of the city, and your thoughts on this, sir?
Yeah, I must say it's pretty depressing. It is a city in which I used to cycle from Hesarghatta to Cantonment. Now I can't do that. No chance. But all I can say is that in spite of this change, at least in Bangalore, I find there are young people willing to challenge various issues. And I was really impressed that when an attempt was made by politicians to build an elevated highway to airport, it was stopped. And that shows there is some, energy and attempt to challenge authority here. So I think we can be an example for other cities in India because we are more green than other cities. Our greenery has somewhat gone down in some parts of the city, but still we are very green. When you arrive by flight, you can see Bangalore is still green. And as long as there are young people willing to challenge authority who want to go the traditional way, I think there's hope. I think Bangalore still gives you hope in spite of all the change.
Absolutely. Taking a thought from you, Ulka, you talked about how when you spoke about solar and storage was the missing link there. So, in fact, we have seen this emerging green economy for the country. There was a time when it was all as he rightly pointed out, it was all about coal, and of course you will only burn what nature has endowed you with. No one thought about solar. Solar now has come to a stage where we are talking about 100 gigawatt of solar by 2022. We are coming out with these large tenders which are being scaled, and this is primarily because of economies of scale that the tariffs have come down. We are talking about tariffs which are as low as, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like 243 and 244, 244 for solar and 243 for wind. So have we made that dent? Mind you, this is an infirm source of power. So you can only have solar when the sun shines, since there's no storage. Even wind, there have been problems elsewhere as well, because wind patterns are changing. And as we are talking about climate change here, even climate change is impacting both solar and wind generation. So how do you see that start has been made, and where do you see that going from here?
Does this work? Yeah.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think there's clearly a long way to go. Why I take hope and encouragement is that a lot of the targets that India has declared internationally, we're already doing much better. We're on track to meet those targets. So I think we should be open to the next technological breakthrough that might be just around the corner and which might change the entire game.
That you mean storage there?
Storage, or it could be other, it could be other things as well. I wanted to link your question back to the issue that you asked about Bangalore, actually. And one of the things that I heard recently, maybe wrong, is that Bangalore has within it something like 6,000 urban villages. They're talking about the larger sort of region of Bangalore. And so it's important to think of it from the perspective of somebody living in one of those villages gets subsumed by the city, as the city expands. What happens to the social fabric of a resident of this kind of an urban village? And you're surrounded by this sort of prosperity. What kind of jobs are we offering them? And this is something that is very closely linked to the opportunities that renewables in fact offers. The skill development mission of the government, one of the things that they're training people in Bangalore is to set up these rooftop solar voltaic systems. It's quite a technically challenging thing. So here again, there is a link between, as this transition happens, how do you ensure that those who are most in need don't lose out from this transition as it's happening, but it in fact benefits them as well as society at large in terms of meeting our climate goals.
Sure. In fact, sir, you mentioned something very interesting. You talked about how the temperature part of it, where you said that while the Bangalore mean temperature has gone up by 2 degrees, so average temperatures over the past 6 decades have been increasing across South Asia, particularly India, where 75% is dependent on agriculture. Dr. Kathuria spoke about how it's going to impact, and also the way that the water has been allocated. So for example, he took an example of rice being brought out of Punjab and sugar being sent out of Maharashtra. My question to you is this battle already lost, given that some of it, as he rightly pointed out, we have actually the temperatures, no matter whatever is being talked about, the temperature battle is absolutely not within our control now. Your views, sir?
Yeah, that's right. We already crossed 1 degree, and 1.5 is the illusory target, can be met, it will cross. 2 is probably also going to cross. So I think we are going to face a huge challenge, because whatever efforts are made, 2 degrees, something is going to happen. Okay? You have to live with that. And agriculture is going to face the biggest challenge, because all the data shows as the temperature rises, yields will go down.
Right.
And so we have to find new ways to increase the yield. But as already pointed out, the biggest mistake we are making as a society is the way water is being used to grow rice and sugarcane, which to me, although I eat rice, I know that is not an essential crop. And in this state, ragi was very popular,
right,
and ragi has gone out of fashion. So I hope it will come back. I think it's coming back partly due to health reasons. So I think there is a need for a social movement in which to tell people that rice is not a desirable grain to eat.
So you're talking about...
And neither is sugar, right? I don't know why sugar is an essential element of our society. But all our politicians own sugar farms, and we are stuck with that. I don't know how we're going to get out of that. thing, I don't know.
I get the sugar part of it. So with rice, be taking it out of one's food habit is, I think
No,
it's
but if you look at the long history of India, I think only the rich people ate rice. I think it was this one was the upper caste.
so we have become aspirational.
I think see, now people are eating ragi because it is better for their
Health.
sugar level, right? So I hope that fashion brings it back in a big way. Because especially Karnataka, large part of Karnataka is water stressed, and ragi is the way to go, not rice.
Pertinent point, sir. So you talked about national security. Now, so when you're talking about national security, of course, food security is a part of it, right? And so with this extreme weather conditions which have been talked about. In fact, as we are speaking right now, Central India, there's been obviously the monsoon. There's been when you look at, we're so dependent on monsoons as well. There's a farm distress which is already out there. So what happens now, as in, given that this is absolutely a catch-22 situation. There's no way out of this. We can't talk our way out of it. So your views?
Well, I hope what Professor Srinivasan says doesn't happen, and that is
The sugar or the rice part?
not
of
the
it?
sugar and the rice, the
Yeah.
2-degree question. Because the fact is that even at 1.5, we have evidence of this just now. Jagdish is one of the leaders in that space, and he's absolutely right, and he's talking about ecosystem stress. 50% of our species, whether it's, plant species that produce our food or other species in our forests, they're going to see a 50% reduction in their range. We have never seen this since the beginning of the agricultural revolution, 10,000 years ago. So we're going to have to develop, thankfully India still has a peasant culture where people know how to actually produce a food that can feed many of us who live in these urban environments. But we're going to be able to have to deal with extreme ecologies. And agriculture is not only about agricultural technologies, it's about a culture of actually managing all these resources and uncertainty at the same time. We have no clue about doing this. And the reason why I said it's a national security question is precisely because the Chinese knew that one of the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union was the problem that they had in the late 1980s in terms of food security and food production out of their food basket, along with all the other problems of food prices. So it's a very real and critical question for us, which involve hundreds of millions of people. You're absolutely right. In semi-arid areas of India, there's a transition happening. We're only sealing the edge of that long tail, which is the farmer suicides. But the system, a large number of people are living and growing things in areas which is completely unviable ecologically and increasingly now economically. And simultaneously, like Professor Srinivasan was saying, we have a health crisis. The PDS system has given us a lot of nice things to get and some degrees of food security, but it's creating a huge epidemic as far as lifestyle diseases are concerned, whether it's diabetes or heart disease. Our cities are coercing. So basically, there is a model of development. I think what Ulka is saying is very correct, that we have to radically re-examine. This is not a question of the 70s. We have the opportunity to do this because India is still grounded. And it's not only a question of Bangalore, it's a regional question. We are grounded and we have to keep the balance between rural and urban cultures. And that is very critical. We have a decentralized system of production and consumption. All the cutting edge technologies, all the smart processes of the 21st century are decentralized. We're in a phenomenal place to create this national market which works on decentralized technologies. We've got the IT stuff to happen. But there's some critical things. And I'll close with just one thing that's there. One of the challenges with us in the energy system space is that we have to look at the entire supply chain. Bangalore lost the opportunity of developing or siting of India's largest fab. We don't have a single fab in this country which can deal with any of the silicon technology. So obviously we're going to be dependent on somebody else. That's the opportunity for us. If you have a fab here, all the ancillary industries, all the way from production to, like Ulka is saying, rooftop solar plus whatever it is, you're going to create 1 million jobs in this place. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Right. I'll come to Ulka, but before that, Dr. Jagdish.
I just, in terms of what Professor Srinivasan also saying about changing food habits, if, 150 years ago, people in India hardly ate potatoes. The masala dosa didn't exist. Dosa may have existed, but not the masala dosa. So it is possible for changes in diet and so on. It's not going to happen overnight.
Sure.
A move to millets and pulses. For example, even in the Indo-Gangetic plains, we have made estimates that 10% reduction in water use in agriculture can put back enough water in some of our rivers for the aquatic biodiversity to thrive and for downstream artisanal fisheries to survive and so on. Right. So which means that we are not talking about massive transformations overnight, but very well planned transitions with economic incentives and so on. And you actually have to create a lot of new livelihoods out of one, how to for example, manage biodiversity very creatively in an urban space. That that both in terms of knowledge as well as actually landscape architecture and other skills that will be required for us to do that. Or how do you have all these linear intrusions, highways going through forests, and yet you have very smart mitigation to the extent possible to ensure ecological connectivity, which we are not doing with our national highways and so on. So these are the types of opportunities for new jobs as well and new skills.
True.
So which are linked to the transformations that we need to very creatively think about for adaptation in the future.
Yeah, despite creating the aim of creating 48 kilometers, building 48 kilometers of road every day, right? Ulka, sorry, you were...
Yeah, I wanted to address this question of food and diets from the perspective of a farmer, because a farmer only grows what she can sell. And this is not just a question of the price, but also a question of convenience. Who does she sell to or where, right? So if the demand doesn't exist, the market doesn't exist, you have to create the market, you have to create the entire support system. And I was once doing fieldwork in a district called Jalna in Maharashtra, which is basically a cotton growing district. And this elderly lady, she's a laborer, landless laborer, basically told me, earlier, 30 years ago when I was young, I used to get, people used to grow food, I used to get part of my salary in the form of food. But now everybody is growing cotton, I get only cash, and I'm subject to the vagaries of food price inflation. So we must also look at some of these larger policy issues from the perspective, of one individual. The second point I wanted to talk about is really from forestry. We have this CAMPA, right, where we, there's compensatory afforestation for forest land that has been diverted for other uses. In theory, in principle, makes sense. But what happens is that land that has been diverted continues to be classified as forest land. And you have created new forest, which is, you've cut down biodiversity-rich primary forest and created a new kind of plantation. On paper, you have compensated, but actually you haven't. So I think in all of these larger policy debates and discussions, we must keep two things in mind. One is honesty. We must be at least, when I started talking about introspection, let's at least be honest to ourselves, whatever we portray to the rest of the world. And secondly is inclusive, and let's include the people who are most affected by these decisions and give them some chance to deliberate upon the outcomes.
Sure. One of the things which Dr. Kathuria spoke about was that the West is unlikely to meet its obligations. He didn't mention the president that he was inkling to, but so now with the US walking out of the Paris climate deal, it's a very weird situation which has now emerged. So at some level, it's China which has kind of taken that position, which was traditionally a position which was taken by the West. And in fact, he also talked about some kind of, in fact, this is an ideal time for India and China, whether that kind of a possibility does exist, to collaborate and then take the lead on that front. Do you see, and I'm posing this to the entire panel, do you see such kind of a situation evolving, given that we live in a very interesting neighborhood? But at some level, it's also said that when your interests align, a lot of things then can fall into place. I would like to start with you.
Yeah, I just mentioned that, we have a shared security regime. So, what happens to the Tibetan plateau and the upper catchment of the Brahmaputra, it's something that India and China need to work together on. The Tibetan plateau and the Himalayas are actually at the forefront of climate change impacts already. And also, there are plant transformations of these river systems that is poses a, in some sense, a national security.
So they're trying to
issue.
take the water to Gobi, and is that?
No, hopefully not that far, but certainly there are certain types of transformations which are being planned, and I think that we really need to work together on issues such as river waters. And similarly, we are going to be, we have been planning many projects thinking about that these are stationary systems.
Right.
The monsoon itself is a highly naturally variable system. There's a lot of intraannual variability. Even without climate change, there's going to be a lot of. So we have been talking about so-called water surplus areas, water deficient areas, planning these large-scale transformations of interlinking rivers or diverting rivers. And I think we really need to think about the fact that these things are not carved in stone. When we say something is water deficient or water surplus, surplus for whom and for what, or deficient for whom and for what. And so when you bring in things like changes in cropping patterns, you have other ecosystem-based livelihoods into consideration, the needs of downstream regions for ecological security, then this whole notion of what is surplus and what is deficient needs to be in some sense challenged, and we need to look at other solutions which do not necessarily involve such massive transformations, but look at local and regional alternatives to these as well. In some sense, these should be the last resort. Because they're also very expensive, and they're also going to lead to a lot of disruption as well, in terms of populations, in terms of other issues. So we really need to, I think, in terms of national security, our water security, biodiversity security, ecological security is actually as important as the security emanating from guns and bombs and other things. So
True. Arumar, your views on this?
See, the thing is, this is not only a question of India, China, the US, or whatever it is. This is a question for all humanity. The atmosphere is a commons. We have, in a sense, taken away most of the critical question, the capacity of that commons to absorb what we have. So irrespective of what country does it, the impacts that we're going to see are going to be across the world, and especially in countries which have large populations that are vulnerable. And the most obvious ones in that are India and China. Add the two, they're 3 billion people as far as that's concerned. So we have a great common interest in making sure that we're not going to push hundreds of millions of people back into poverty. I think there's no question about that as far as both our countries are concerned. Food security is a very critical question that we share as far as that's concerned. So there are obviously areas in which we have a great common interest. The monsoon, in terms of science, is not looked at very much by scientists across the rest of the world. We have a great common interest as far as that's concerned. So we have very strong common interests. But we should not be foolish as a region and underestimate the Chinese ability to take a situation of complexity and distress and turn that to their great advantage. India has to be very cautious and work that very carefully, because the future belongs to all of us, and we don't want to be sort of left at the bottom end of the middle income spectrum with the largest number of poor and vulnerable people in the world. And there are great realities of actually that happening.
So so basically you're saying that we should not actually walk into the Chinese dragon trap.
I don't think it's a trap. We have to be pragmatic like China is on things that are of mutual interest. Much of our PV system growth that we're seeing, the 2 rupees that we're seeing, is basically Chinese technology. But remember, where did that come from? It's basically 4th generation Australian technology which China has taken and built out to scale. So the challenge for us is, we've got the top entrepreneurs and scientists in the country sitting in this room. Why can't we do the same thing? Why can't we have our Manhattan project that does the same thing, or even better, in 5 years' time? Supported by the state or done otherwise. We have the ability to do that.
Right.
I think we have the science to do that. ISC is sitting here. We have so many interesting people.
So would you like to weigh in on that?
I want to add something. Nobody's talking about the elephant in the room. It is population. If you're going to add 500 million people, I don't see how you can avoid ecological stress. So I think we have to learn from China how to control our population.
I think we are, so thanks for that. I think we are absolutely out of time. It was a very enthralling discussion, absolutely an education for me. In fact, I would like to, there's a very short Q&A. I would like you to identify yourself. I will just take a couple of questions, that's it, we're absolutely out of time. So identify yourself, your organization, and please state your question and not your views.
I'll start with.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, my name is Prem Kumar. I'm basically from Bangalore, rather Bangalorean.
Right.
I'm brought up here, and as an electrical engineer, I represent a company, Greenbuzz Energy Private Limited. Understanding the today's challenge, there are two things I just wanted to highlight. One is on the energy, and other is on the water.
Is that a question, sir?
Yeah. Just
Okay,
to
yeah.
see the solution part of whatever has been discussed. We have been talking on decentralization of energy solutions. As we go forward, we already have a better solution called fuel cell generation. Fuel cell power generation, which is a decentralized solution implemented very well in Bangalore, in Intel campus, which is an ideal solution. Talking about the trade-off on environment and the growth, this gives more growth rather than the impact on the environment.
I don't still see a question, sir.
No, this is what as a suggestion viewpoint I wanted to highlight, because this is for a rapid growth.
Absolutely, point taken, sir. Can we have the microphone
Thank you very much.
in the front here, please? The gentleman.
On water, I just wanted to highlight, because water pollution is a big challenge. Because knowingly or unknowingly, the RO technology is being used. This is one of the biggest culprit for today's water contamination, both as well as on drinking aspect, as well as on the discharge point of view. I request to look into this point.
Absolutely.
Consider the better technology of water.
A very pertinent point, sir.
Thank
Sir,
you.
please.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. This is Manish from N Possibilities. My question to the panel here is, we have talked a lot about solar, we have talked about a lot of other issues about ecology and biodiversity, but waste management, especially with respect to urbanization, rapid urbanization, is totally missing from the discussion. So want to hear the views of the panelists.
In fact, that was one of the things that I had in mind, but we were absolutely out of time. So it's a very important point, and I'm sure that perhaps for the next opportunity that we so get to hold such conversations in the city, we'll make that a part of the discussion as well. Sir, you wanted to ask a question, please.
Yeah, so I'm Pramod Kumar. I'm also from Indian Institute of Science. So I had one question on the changing landscape of Bangalore. So we are moving from houses to apartments. And then when the panelists suggested that we should go with solar on the rooftop, so where is the rooftop now? So I had an issue. So I have actually been, although I'm born in Bangalore, but we have a house in Jayanagar. So my neighbor installed a solar rooftop panel and he chopped the tree in front of it because there was tree, it was just causing shade and he was not getting enough power. So I'd like to know that in this changing landscape, where your population density is increasing and it's just urbanization, we are just moving vertically up, do you install a water tank on the rooftop, or would you install a solar PV plant, this panel on the rooftop to feed the entire building?
Or a solar roof, the way Teslas of the world are working there, right?
So I would like to know the views of the panelists, that where is the space to install the solar rooftop?
Would you like to take that question, Aramar?
I think the rooftop is a meme in some senses, because now you can do solar on a whole range of surfaces. But the challenge is absolutely right. As you go up to very high buildings, which you don't need actually, you need to actually have high density, medium rise, which you can, the city density has to change. Then it becomes possible to configure those kind of processes as part of what we're talking about. That's not the only solution. Sorry.
And quickly, just to add from the business model perspective, people are leasing other people's rooftops as well. So you may not even have your own rooftop, but you could lease it. And there are ways to even structure the, the revenue that you would earn from a shared rooftop, in an apartment complex where no one resident owns the rooftop. So there are policy pilots that are being done in Delhi, Pondicherry, and other places. And these are really kind of details that can be worked out through innovative business models.
Yeah,
and Germany shows this very clearly. If you look at the post-Fukushima transition, it's real.
Yeah, and utilities need to be on board for the same, right? Anil had a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry as a host, I'm being unfair, butting in with a question, but I couldn't resist with this. It's been a fantastic panel. You simply challenged every notion that we have been brought up to believe in. So my question to you is, how do you, and you can be overwhelmed. I'm simply overwhelmed because you have challenged every notion in my head about how we should tackle the issue of fallout of climate change. So how does this enter the governance lexicon? How do you go about bringing it into the governance lexicon, making the politician, all of us stakeholders, so that this is genuinely implemented and not just restricted to our kind of conversations?
My problem has always been that politicians always thought of climate change as a problem created by the Americans and the Europeans and not our problem. So I think that's why I have to tell them that most of the problem that we face today is created locally, not globally. Otherwise, easy to blame the villain out there in the Trump land and not take action. So many of our political leaders, except a few very good ones, the rest of them don't think it's our problem. They think it's somebody else's problem.
See, building a political constituency out of those who are likely to be impacted most by climate change or other types of transformations which are part of the challenges facing us. I think that is very critical because it is, for example, I just say why wasn't there a lot of political stake in, say, rejuvenating the Ganga for a long time, because all the constituencies that are the way they are designed, the way they are located in space, do not lend itself to building up a political constituency that can work together to put pressure on the political establishment. So I think the key is to how do you harness. I think there are good signs in some places. So, for example, coastal districts in Karnataka are getting worried about the abstraction of water upstream for diversion to Bangalore or other places, right? Similarly, people living in the Sundarbans are worried about the transformations that are happening. In the Himalayas, we see that there is a lot of migration of people. There's actually villages being abandoned, and agriculture is being abandoned in some of the areas in Uttarakhand, and it's becoming a political issue. I think that those of us who are, all of us who are stakeholders, we need to reach out to the political establishment. Because politicians are very smart people. When they actually find that there is a political constituency for a particular issue, they do respond quickly to that. And I think we as a community, whether it's scientists, academics, NGOs and so on, our connect with the political establishment on critical issues such as environment, climate change and all has not been effective, or I don't think that we have even tried hard enough.
It's a challenging question, but I think the first thing, like we said, is we have to accept that we are both part of the problem and part of the solution. And the second thing, which I think the climate discourse and in global environmental discourse has really not brought to the fore, is we always talk about this affecting our children and our grandchildren. In actual fact, most of us are going to live 70 or 80 years. We are going to see the impacts of climate in our own lives. That is the reason why we have to act just now. Which means that if you're a politician today, you're taking a decision about an energy system or agriculture system, etc., before you die, you will see the impact, either positive or negative, to happen. So there's a great opportunity there. This is a $1 trillion opportunity. Why do you think China has put so much of resources behind it, their entire financial system, to make this happen? Because it's a tremendous opportunity to transform your economy from a 1920th one that was invented, out of England, and we have then adopted across the world. So we have the opportunity to make that change, and we have to grab it with both hands in some senses. But the critical thing that we don't realize is if we get this overshoot, the impact on us is that we will have to sequester carbon. We'll have to take it from the atmosphere in crazy ways, or we have to grow things on the ground. If we grow things on the ground, then exactly what Jagdish is going to talk about is actually going to happen. There's going to be a conflict between biomass use for food, water, and actual livelihood. And that's a very, very challenging question. The way that, when I've talked to, let's say, people from UP, senior politicians, the meme that I use is, आप ये ज़रा सोचिए कि प्रयाग में in the 2030s जब कुंभ का मेला होगा, वहाँ पानी नहीं होगा, तो कैसा कुंभ होगा? People really have to grab this with both hands. This is a cultural question.
Our culture is not about, being in opposition with nature. Everything that we've been taught, every sort of, faith system in this country is about working with nature and responding to it. We're destroying the entire basis of civilization across the world because the biosphere is what we depend upon. That message, whether it comes from social media, whether it comes from political speeches, whether it comes from religious leaders, whether it comes from young people, is what has to become part of our everyday discourse. And that's why the media is so important in it. People like us are, voiceless and whatever it is. We can only give you some science and a few other things. But we have to tell this story.
The point is that our political lifetime scale of 5 years, Chinese have 100 years. As a matter of fact, I would like to say that this city of Bangalore was better managed by the Mysore Maharajas than after the independence, because they had a much longer time scale. That's a challenge. How do you make them think beyond 5 years? Not easy.
So job security at the end of it. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to our panel. I absolutely enjoyed this. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your time. And that brings to an end our Bangalore conversation. Thank you.
We request all of you to kindly stay back as we have a small token of appreciation from our team. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mr. Anil Padmanabhan to join us on stage to present the souvenirs to all the panelists for their valuable time. Let's keep applauding for all our proud panelists here, ladies and gentlemen. A small token of appreciation which is brought to you by Danfoss and Mint. Well, we request Mr. Anil to kindly stay back to join us on stage once again. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome on stage Ms. Swati Sharda, the Vice President from Marketing and Business Operations from Mint, to join us on stage as well. Yes, a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. With the conclusion of today's event, we come to the end of the Transformation Agenda event series. And we would like to thank the key people behind the initiatives. May I please invite on stage Mr. Ravi Chandran, the President from Danfoss India, to present a small token of appreciation to Mr. Anil and Swati, please. We request you to kindly walk up to the center stage. A small token of appreciation which is brought to you by Danfoss India. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And now we request Ms. Swati to deliver the vote of thanks for all of us.
Good evening, everyone. Great discussions today on a very pertinent topic of climate imperatives. Mint had initiated a great partnership a few months ago with Danfoss, and we've come a long way. 4 major themes of infrastructure, food, energy, and climate have been very well covered. We thoroughly enjoyed the journey. Thank you, Danfoss, for this opportunity. Ravi Krishna, we loved working with your team. I'd like to thank Dr. Rajat Kathuria for sparing his time and sharing his thoughts with us today. All the speakers and our moderator for the evening, Utpal Bhaskar. Anil, thank you for stitching this together. And lastly, all of you for being a wonderful audience. Please join us for cocktail and dinner outside. Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much for all that love and support, ladies and gentlemen. And now we request all of you to kindly network and bond together as we have the dinner and cocktails open for all of you. Thank you so much once again for all that love and support. And this is your host, Navita, signing off. Good night, Shubhratri, and happy networking. Thank you.